openings, but also a lot of
Depends on how we define heresy.
My son's a
Like
data
with the Destiny
analytics
2
guy,
season, it's pretty good.
and he's worked in consulting for Toyota. He was doing a consulting business. He was a consultant for a consulting firm,
Does anybody have a duck?
but he's now working with a company
You do have
where
that.
he
Okay.
interviewed with for this position that they
No, I threw it
recruited
back
him
at
to.
Josh.
Oh, you threw it back at Josh.
And he
Okay.
basically wrote the job description. It's all data analytics.
Josh, can I
And I
have a
set him
duck?
up to interview
Can I have
with
a
a
duck?
data science guy. And the data science guy kept asking
Sorry to
me
interrupt.
questions about data science. He said, well, the job that I'm interviewing for does not include the disciplines you're asking me about. And the guy
It's also
wouldn't back
because
off. He kept
my
asking.
throat is very fried right now
Anyway,
from
So
all
he
of
and the
today.
data science, he got the job. But he and
so
the
maybe
data
I just
science
sound a
guy,
bit more
he leads the
professional.
data science division, and they're kind of stovepiped over there, not very supportive of the company's mission. So, anyway.
Not a well spiral job.
Well, the question is going to be, can he keep the job?
Yeah.
My son is now, I think, influential enough in the company that he may have difficulty keeping his job if he doesn't start helping the company. So, anyway, but I guess data science guys tend to
Just
be
be a really long duck wrapped around
pretty proprietary.
Like the neck?
They
would
don't
be a
really
duck
like
farm.
to have other divisions tell them what to do.
Oh, yeah.
even
And
when
you
they
could
work for
sell
the
it.
other
Oh,
division.
I don't know.
I'm sure
Bit of a problem.
I mean, some people have the last name
They'll work it
Duckworth.
out.
So, I mean, that duck must be worth
They're
something.
working for an organization.
Well, anyway, let's start.
They're primarily doing what the organization says you should.
Yeah, you would think.
It doesn't seem very complicated.
Do the Fox intro of. Okay. All right. Yes. Hello, everybody. Happy Holy Week. We are. Huh?
What? Nothing.
You were saying that in response to Holy Week?
I was saying that's my residence.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, happy Holy Week, everybody. Special welcome to everybody who is joining us as a result of Res Fair, which was great today. I hope y'all had an opportunity to go and check out other groups on campus who are serving and worshiping God, and it's great to be able to do that together at least one day a year. So we're, apropos the resurrection that we are celebrating the end of this week, we have Dr. Rick Townsend, who has been really integral in our group, founding it, keeping it alive, has his PhD from UT Dallas, right? Yeah,
True.
Believe it or not. And
History of ideas.
History of ideas.
Relevant for tonight.
Yes, exactly. So he's going to be defending the resurrection for us, giving us a comprehensive case. Run ahead.
Well, thank you for the invitation. It's always exciting to come here. I enjoy this group. I did spend 8 years getting a degree here. So if for those of you it's taking you too long, it's probably not.
Amen.
I went back to school toward the end of my airline career. I was an Air Force fighter pilot and then an airline pilot. And toward the end of my airline career, I wanted to do something in retirement. I'm still trying to figure out what to do when I grow up. So part of that was getting a degree in something I could do research on as a retiree. So I also wanted I wanted to be able to be relevant to the Christian faith, but I wanted to get a degree from a secular university. So doing that here at UT Dallas was one of the few options I had that was commutable, and it also allowed me to research something at least relevant to history of the Christian church and apologetics. And so this history of ideas is kind of a mix of all of those things put together. And so my passion is defending the faith. But I wanted to go to a school where I could find people I disagreed with and figure out how to engage them. What I found out was people I disagree with don't want to be engaged. They want to be affirmed. And so I did a lot of affirming and not as much engaging as I would have liked. But I did get a chance to do some research that I think that helped me understand how people I disagree with think and what the content of their arguments relies on. And so tonight, it's my privilege to talk to you about the resurrection. this is the most important event in Christianity. Obviously, we're coming up on the most important holiday in Christianity. My initial exposure to evidence for Christianity was pretty early. I was about your age. I graduated from college and was in Air Force pilot training and was in a Bible study with some guys I'd gone to college with, Frank, Bob, and Mike. And they invited me to a Bible study, and I thought, well, they're my friends. I can't turn them down. And so the Bible study was in the book of Romans. Now, they had done Bible study before. I had not. And so we were rotating leadership, and for some reason it was my turn to lead. And at some point it came out that I thought, we were in Romans 1, by the way, where it talks about God is evident in creation. From the invisible things, his invisible qualities are revealed in the visible qualities of things that he's made, from Romans 1:20. And so I stupidly said something about, I thought evolution probably happened, but that God directed it. And so they asked, what's your evidence for that? And so I said, well, that's what we were taught. And they said, well, what's your evidence? I said, well, that's what all the professors believe, and that's what, and they said, what's your evidence? I kept hounding. And so that was about 50 years ago, and for the last 50 years, I've been looking for the evidence of evolution. I still can't find it. But there is evidence of things that we believe in as Christians, and so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. So I want us to start tonight thinking about some key words that describe key events in the life of Christ. So just sit back for a minute and think about these words. So tonight we're going to look at evidence for that last point, the resurrection. This is going to be the bottom line up front for those of you who like outlines. I like outlines. So if Christ was raised from the dead by his own authority, then he is the Savior. And that's where we're going to try and go tonight. And I hope to, at least if that's not where you are in terms of your faith walk at this point, I hope it's something you'll think about, and we'll talk about why that will be important at the end. So the question is, if Jesus existed, and there's no serious scholar who questions whether Jesus existed, if the history we have is reliable, then it should be something we can research and something for which we can find evidence. And so tonight what we're going to do is we're going to look for evidence of the resurrection. We're going to do that in a fairly simple way. We're going to look at what is historical reliability. We're going to use Gary Habermas' minimal facts argument as kind of a framework. We're going to focus on one particular aspect of that more than anything else. And if I can establish that one aspect, the rest falls into place. We'll look at alternative explanations for the resurrection. There are other stories that are out there, and we'll look at some of those. Then we'll kind of put those things together, the minimal facts along with the alternative explanations, and see what holds water. And we'll do a little data analysis. And then we'll talk about why it matters. So that's kind of where we're going. So we'll start with historical reliability, okay? And there's a few things that historians look at that are important in determining whether a narrative is reliable from a historic perspective. One of the most important things is the data that we have, the written record. It might be archaeology, it might be a stone tablet, it might be scrolls. Is that early as in close enough to the event that it could be the eyewitnesses who are recording it, as opposed to something that's passed along down the telephone game that you guys have all played before. And you start with a puppy and you end up with a unicorn. It just doesn't work very well. But if the data is early, then it can be, it's more likely it's reliable. We also want something where even people who disagree with the conclusion of a story would be telling the same story. So if the enemies in this case, those who are opposed to Christianity, are recording essentially the same facts, that's another good determination or a good factor determining that it may be true. Next is if there are embarrassing details. Typically, if I'm going to write a historic epic narrative about me being the hero, I'm not going to include embarrassing details. So if there are embarrassing details, then it's more likely that that story is true because you would not include them otherwise. But if you're being candid and transparent, then you might include those. And then there should be some degree of dissimilarity. So if Alan and I get together and we decide we're going to pull off some kind of a heist, and then we go to the police and our stories match word for word, what does that tell you? Conspiracy, collusion, right? But if there are minor differences, we were on opposite sides of the street and we both saw something happen. Maybe I saw one person involved in a particular way. He saw two because from my perspective, one was behind the other. You can see where from different perspective there would be some minor differences, but the crime being pulled off and the victim being assaulted or whatever the story is, if the major details are the same, but there are some dissimilarities, that's also a good mark of reliable witnesses. And then there's, again, looking for non-conspiratorial stories. And again, that's the collusion idea, where there's no motivation for us to tell a story to get, to advance a cause for our personal gain. And again, we're not colluding on the details. And then should be a neutral observer. There should be at least some neutral observers who don't have a dog in the fight that are telling a story that is relatively similar to the main narrative that we're trying to verify. So those are kind of the main historic markers that we look at. And then in some cases, we're going to look with a microscope and look really close. We're going to look at a couple of details really closely, but then we're going to look at other details with more of a big picture, more of a telescope, lay of the land look. So as we go along, you'll see that I'm going to focus in on a couple details and sort of not necessarily gloss over, but not spend a lot of time on some of the others. So let's talk about this minimal facts argument. Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, but primarily Gary Habermas, came up with this idea that there are certain facts about which all of the historians agree. And you will find various kinds of corroborating evidence, both among those who agree with in this case, the Christian faith. So if the Christians are telling a story, that's great, but they are motivated to tell the story because they want it to come out a particular way. Possibly they might twist it in their favor. But if the enemies, those who are opposed to Christianity, are telling the same story, again, that is something that would help us to know that this story is true. So this is the first story, the first point in the narrative. That we're going to use 5 different points. Habermas started out with 12. He's kind of narrowed it down to where now in his talks he uses 5. I've seen as few as 4. We're going to use 5 tonight. But the first one is that Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. And so that's going to be a key point that we really want to make sure that we agree on. And that's where we'll use the microscope. We're going to use a fair amount of detail to look at whether he died and whether it was by Roman crucifixion. The next one is that the tomb was empty. That when people went to the tomb, there was nobody there. There was no body there, and there was nobody there. Okay, so there was no body in the tomb. And again, we find secular historians as well as those who are pro-Christianity talking that same point. This next one, not that Jesus was risen from the dead, but that many who saw him after he was crucified believed that they had seen him risen from the dead. So we can't prove that Jesus rose from the dead by any kind of scientific method other than eyewitness testimony and so on. but we can prove by their testimony that they believed it. We can prove by their changed lives that they believed that something definitely had happened to this guy, that they believed he had risen from the dead. There were also hostile witnesses, those who were hostile to the faith, who became witnesses and became in favor, who were also transformed by this experience of meeting what they believed to be the risen Christ. And so there were skeptics who were converted, and their lives were changed to the point that they were willing to die for their faith. So that's point number 4. And point number 5, these narratives, these ideas were written down early, definitely within the eyewitness of the time that the eyewitnesses would have been alive. So I doubt if there's anybody in here other than me, maybe Alan, who remembers something as far back as the JFK assassination. Did you remember that? Too young for that? Yeah. So think about something early in your life. That's the earliest one for me that's a major deal that I can remember. And I can remember where I was, who it was who broke the news to my 3rd grade class that the president had been killed. Now, that was during my lifetime. That memory, even though it's many years ago, is as vivid as things that happened more recently. So when something really big happens in your lifetime, you remember it well. Now, for some of you, that might be 9/11. For some of you, it might be something more recent. Give me something that really stands out to you as a major event that you experienced during your lifetime. The pandemic. That would be, a big one. Okay. Anything else? There you go. Okay. So for any number of reasons, those things would stand out, right? So I will guarantee you that 50 years from now, you will remember those events. And surprisingly, some of the details will be so crystal clear that it's almost as if no time has gone by. And so that's what we're thinking about when we think about this guy who was a teacher and a healer, who was suddenly turned on by the authorities and was crucified. And then people said he rose from the dead, or maybe you were one of the ones who saw him rise from the dead. That would be one of those things that was written. So if the writing was within the lifespan of those who were the eyewitnesses, that's an early recollection. So even though it's 2, 3, even 4 or 5 decades later, if they are writing as eyewitnesses, and then we also think there's validity if the disciples were the ones who were trained by that first generation. We call those the church fathers. So the disciples of John, for example, come up, and we'll mention a couple of those, who clearly remember John telling them what he remembered, what he saw. And we'll have some of those witnesses. So the narratives are early enough that it's not a telephone game. It is the actual stories that were told by people who witnessed the events. So let's dive in. We'll look first of all at, was Jesus killed by Roman crucifixion? I think one of the important ways or helpful ways to think about whether or not he was killed was to look at who did the killing. So who did the killing? Romans. So it turns out these Romans are kind of interesting guys. Roman soldiers they were trained professionals. They were known as for their discipline, training, and stamina. They were a highly effective fighting force. They had a lot of camaraderie. The key characteristics: they had rigorous training. They had mental training focused on marching, fighting in formations, mastering their weapons. They carried weapons and equipment long distances. They were in good shape. They were not to be trifled with. Something else that we know about these guys: they were disciplined. So they were trained in exactly how to march, how to hold their weapons, how to use those weapons, and they put on displays of their ability to do that. They fought as a unit rather than individuals. They always did things as a collaborative team, and they worked together. So they were expected to support each other no matter what. They were also equipped well. They had a large variety of weapons and tools depending on what they were going to do. They would use those tools in a variety of ways to overcome their adversaries. They were organized in ways that they could use these shields to ward off an attack of arrows or spears or even advancing troops, and they were they were skilled in these fighting formations that allowed them to be very effective at whatever they were tasked to do. They were all organized into small units where they lived, trained, and fought together. So it was like being in a club where you knew the guys really well. They fostered, again, a strong sense of loyalty and camaraderie. They were recruited from mostly Roman citizens, not from slaves. They did have auxiliary forces that were non-citizens, but the primary fighting units were always the citizens who had the vested interest in the country. And they were expected to have good character. They were supposed to be virtuous, and those things were highly emphasized. So they were also motivated in a number of ways, but one of those was by discipline and by punishment. And so we have a number of stories and historic ways to look at these guys. There was a thing called a fustuarium. I'm not sure if that's how they pronounce it. It's a death penalty where condemned soldiers were beaten to death by other soldiers. And as a soldier, you were expected to take part in these ritual executions if your unit was called on to do that. There was also a thing called a decimation. Have you ever heard of decimation? You know what that means? 1 out of every 10 was selected by lot, and so if the unit had not done a good job taking the battlefield, they would occasionally use this motivation method to get them motivated to do better next time. And so they divide them up into groups of 10. They draw lots by 10, and whatever soldier was picked out would be killed by the other 9. It was a brutal form of execution. For serious offenses like desertion or sleeping on guard duty, they would be killed on the spot. They wouldn't even wait for a formal execution. They would just do it on the spot. They would do beatings for minor infractions, which could result in flogging or other forms of punishment. They could be imprisoned for failing to secure prisoners. They could be demoted, fined, or lose privileges. In some cases, they could be publicly humiliated, and I didn't find out exactly what that looked like, but if this is what it looked like if you were going to be beaten to death, I can't imagine it's going to be very pleasant. So the harsh discipline was designed to instill obedience and ensure the effectiveness of the fighting force. So you've got these guys that are really motivated to do their job well, or else. No pressure, right? Okay. So a few other things about these Roman soldiers. They knew death. They fought against adversaries. They knew when an adversary was dead. They were experts in knowing if this guy that they were fighting was going to maybe, of course you see it in the movies where the guy comes back to life, struggles to get his pistol and shoot. Well, they didn't have pistols, right? But they also didn't want the guy to put his spear up and have you land on it or something. So they knew death. They knew what it looked like when someone was dead. They were experts in that. And if I haven't mentioned it before, they were professional killers. So they knew how to kill, they knew the signs of death, and they knew how to carry it out. So the question is, are they always successful? And there are some rumors that think some of the stories we'll look at, the alternative theories. One of those is that Jesus survived his crucifixion. And it turns out there is a story of someone surviving crucifixion. This is Josephus. Now, Josephus was a Jewish historian who, after the fall of Rome in the late 1st century, he basically switched sides and became a historian for the Romans. He was a very meticulous historian. His works are highly respected. And Josephus at one point tells a story that 3 of his friends were being crucified, and he went to the Titus, who was the commander of the troops at that point, and he said, "Hey, I got some buddies up there. Any chance we can, get them down?" And somehow he talked Titus into letting them get down off the cross. So they took these 3 guys down off the cross, gave them the best medical treatment possible, and one of the 3 survived. We don't know how long he was up there. We don't have any reason to believe that he was beaten or scourged or flogged before he was put up there, but he did survive the crucifixion. But again, he was taken down while he was still fairly early in the process and was alive and was able to be treated. So what that really says is that even if you are taken down off the cross, your chances of survival are minimal. So being taken down off a cross when they think you're dead, probably not much of a chance of survival. There's no other recorded instances of anyone surviving crucifixion. So then the question becomes, well, what about Jesus? Could he have survived his crucifixion? And looking at that, the counterexample of the one out of the three that was taken off the cross, it doesn't really serve well as a parallel for the crucifixion of Jesus, because we know from the stories that are written down that he was severely beaten before he was put on the cross. It doesn't demonstrate that it was survivable as much as it demonstrates that the severity of the punishment, even with medical intervention, is not likely to result in anyone surviving this brutal form of torture. So it's not, it shouldn't be taken as a sign that Jesus may have survived. It should be taken as a sign that almost no one could have survived. Yeah.
You might be about to bring this up. There's also an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association about the death of Jesus, and its conclusion is that it's almost guaranteed that he died due to the emission of water when he was stabbed, which is a sign of, I believe it's severe pressure on the lungs.
We will get to that. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, that's a really important study that was done just in this century. Well, it's last century, late 1960s, I think. It was the 80s. Okay, but it was within the last few decades that this medical analysis was done on what probably killed Jesus. And we'll talk about that briefly in a little bit. So probably not survivable. Again, because we know that Jesus was beaten before he was put on the cross. In fact, the Romans' form of beating was not limited like the Jews' was. So the Jewish law said that you could not give anyone more than 40 lashes, or could not give, they said you couldn't give more than 40 lashes. So they would always give 39 lashes to make sure they didn't miscount and didn't go over the limit. The Romans didn't have that rule. So they were known to do very severe beatings before crucifixions, to the extent that many of the people did not survive even getting to the cross. So he was beaten severely before even getting to the cross. The weapon that they used would have been a Roman scourge or a flagrum, and it's a fairly short whip, and it has pieces of glass, rock, and sharp-edged stone that are woven into the leather strips that come off of the handle. So it was a brutal form of torture. They would embed these sharp edges in someone's flesh and then pull back and typically rip the flesh into ribbons. And again, lots of blood loss. People go into shock. A lot of people, again, would die just of the beating. So pretty brutal. And if any of you have seen The Passion of the Christ, I think it depicts it well. So then after all of that, he was nailed to this cross, having already undergone severe blood loss and pain of this beating that happened before the crucifixion. The pain of the nails going into your hands and feet is something that I can't even imagine, but it has to be excruciating. And then, as you probably have read before, the way that a person typically dies is asphyxiation, because you are hanging from your arms, and you have to, in order to breathe in, you have to take the pressure off of your arms and push up with your feet on your feet that are nailed to the cross, typically one heel over the other, and then the nail goes through both feet at once. So you're pressing down on that until you can't stand the pain there, and then you gasp for breath and let yourself down and exhale, and it's just back and forth. Again, just an excruciating way to die.
Can I mention, that's relevant, I think, for the point that they knew he was dead because you wouldn't see him pushing up anymore to breathe.
Right.
If that happens for a few minutes,
right,
it's guaranteed. The person is dead.
Yeah, you can live without food for a couple weeks. I could probably live for a little longer than that. You can live without water for a couple days. You can live without air for a couple minutes. So yeah, if you don't breathe for a couple of minutes, it's all over.
On top of losing
On
all the
top,
blood,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then at the end of all that, just to make sure, they broke the legs of the other prisoners who were being executed with him. But the story in Mark says the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, so they asked Pilate to have the legs broken and the bodies taken down. The soldiers therefore came and broke the legs of the first man who had been crucified with Jesus, and then those of the other. But when they came to Jesus, they found he was already dead. They did not break his legs. Instead, the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Again, from the end of the book of John. So we know that they did not break any of his bones, which has fulfilled a prophecy as well. But they did spear him and saw this flow of blood and water. What doctors now tell us is what that means is the sac of the heart, the pericardium, was pierced, and there had been enough time that had gone by since he died that there had been time for blood and water to separate, so that there was blood that came out first and then water that came out second. Blood being more dense than the water or the fluid. It would have looked like a clear fluid like water was actually the pericardial heart fluid around the sac of the heart. And so he had been dead long enough for that sorting out of the density of the fluids to be obvious to anyone who was looking. Of course, they didn't know until centuries later what that really meant, but it's a sign that we know now that he died certainly a long time before the fact. So whether there is some controversy about whether he died of asphyxiation or from blood loss, from shock, but we know that he had been dead for some period before the spear pierced his side. So then he was buried, and here's the story of that. Now there was a man named Joseph, member of the council. He was a good and upright man. He didn't consent to the crucifixion. He came from this town in Arimathea. Going to Pilate, he asked for Jesus' body, took it down, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and placed it in a tomb cut in the rock, one which no one had yet been laid. So we now have this idea of this Joseph of Arimathea going to get the body, claiming it, and then wrapping it in a linen cloth. I didn't want to go into a lot of detail on the Shroud of Turin, but I think this may well be the burial shroud of Christ. That'd be a separate talk, but it's a fascinating one that we may be able to do some point in the future. Have you guys had a talk on the shroud?
Yeah, we've never had a presentation
Okay.
on it, so that's something you study a lot. That might be a candidate.
I relied on Gary Habermas, so we used a lot of his videos when we talked about it. But I think it's at least worth. It's in the running.
It's got enough evidence
Yeah.
to be put out there for evaluation.
Yeah. So real briefly, if you have not heard of the Shroud of Turin, it is a single long piece of cloth which has the image of a man. One side of the shroud would have been the back side, and the other side, like it was wrapped around over the body if the body is laying here, and the other side is the top side. The most unique thing about it is that it's a negative image. And there's no technology that anyone knows today where you can get that kind of an image imprinted on fabric. It's not a burn mark. It's not pigment from paint. They can't really figure out exactly what it is, but it's a discoloration. And it's, as I say, a negative image. So if this is, it seems like the gospel writers mention this. In fact, every gospel, all four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all mention this linen cloth. This is from Mark. In Matthew, it says they wrapped him in a clean linen cloth. In Luke, it says, again, Joseph, a member of the council, not consented to their death. He took it down, wrapped it in a cloth, placed it in a tomb. And then John, we get a little bit more detail in John, so let me go to that one. I think that's the next slide. In John, we find that this Joseph of Arimathea took the body down. He got Pilate's permission to do so. He was accompanied by Nicodemus, who was also one of the priests. And Nicodemus brings a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds, taking the Jesus body. The two of them wrapped it with the spices in strips of linen in accordance with the Jewish burial customs. We don't know exactly what they did with all of this 75 pounds. Myrrh is something that's used, and apparently it's a fairly sticky, kind of an ointment substance that would have been very difficult to remove from the body, but it was a preserving agent. Yeah, did you have something?
Yeah, I was just looking up about the Shroud of Turin,
Uh-huh.
and there's at least one article that claims that that the apparent bloodstains on it were made with pigment in a gelatin medium.
Well, there are lots of claims, again, beyond the scope of tonight's discussion, but that would be worth looking at for future. But it's a fascinating study. And again, we'll chalk that up for another time. But it is an interesting artifact that is still visible and available to look at today. Yeah, I mean, it's been tested with carbon dating, but it turns out it comes out in the 1500s, but then they found out they took the carbon dating sample from a patch and not the original cloth. It's been the subject of quite a detective story over a number of centuries. But again, we have the linen, but we also have this mix of spices. Now, we're told that the women went after the Sabbath was over, the Passover Sabbath, to do some more care of the body. We don't know exactly what they were going to do, since they say it was wrapped in 75 pounds of spices and a linen cloth. So we don't know if the linen cloth was against the body and the spices were outside of that. Whatever they did it fairly quickly, because they had to get the body down and buried before sunset. So they probably did a fairly quickie job, if you will, and the women were trying to come back and do a more respectful treatment of the body. But again, we don't know exactly what the configuration is of the linens. We do know, we'll find out in a future verse that's coming up, that there were a couple of different cloths that they used to wrap him, which I can't make sense of the Shroud of Turin from that one either, because there's a separate burial cloth around his head. So we know that when the women went the next day or 2 days later, there was an angel there that they saw, and the tomb was empty. They said, "Do not be afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen." Again, those words, "He's not here" and "He's risen," are in all four of the gospel narratives. So come and see the place where he lay. And so, again, this is in Matthew, but again, that same narrative, the same idea, "He's not here, he's risen," is in all four. Now, in some cases, we find the disciples so Peter and John go and look into the tomb, and they don't see anything, and they leave, and then Mary is weeping outside the tomb and then sees an angel. So the timing of the angels is a little bit different between some of the stories, but again, the narrative, the key point is that there is a message to someone in all four of the Gospels that he's not here and he's risen. So next we want to look at the fact that people seemed to be convinced that they had seen the risen Jesus. And so when we look at, these are just a list of some of the people that said that they had in fact seen the risen Jesus. And it was many of the disciples. It was at the Mount of Olives. To John later in the late first century, probably around 85 to 90, he saw an appearance of the Lord Jesus as well. So for over the 40-day period between the resurrection and the ascension, there was a fair amount of sightings of this dead guy come back to life. But then there would be occasional sightings even after that. And we'll look at a couple of those. So now some of those would all be pretty much, well, not all of them, we'll come to a couple. So a couple of those on the list would have been hostile to the Christian faith. So James was Jesus' brother. And we know that James earlier in the Gospels was not a believer. In fact, he was with the family when the family kind of said, "Hey, you're getting a lot of line here. Why don't you come on back and we'll have you spend some time with the family and we'll get you straightened out." And Jesus said, "No, these are my brothers and sisters here, and you guys hang out however you want." So James was not a believer early in the gospel narratives. And then we have him later saying that he had seen an appearance of his brother. And James becomes a convert where he had been an opponent. Now, any of you have brothers and sisters? So can you imagine your brother or sister suddenly saying, hey, I'm God? How would that go over? Probably kind of like Joseph in the Old Testament when he said, you guys are going to bow down to me. It just doesn't go well, you know? A little bit of humility. But I don't think Jesus went around saying, hey, I'm God, to his brothers and sisters, but his actions obviously said that. And again, so it would be hard for someone like James, who grew up with this guy, probably kind of a goody two-shoes. He was never getting in trouble, right? But God? No, the Messiah? I mean, come on, my brother. I know this guy. There's no way. But at any rate, James does become a believer, and he becomes the leader of the church in Jerusalem before he's executed around 60 AD. So again, he from the time of about the mid-30s, by 33 to 35 AD, whenever Christ, we're not sure exactly what year that is. I lean toward 33. Other people say 30 to 35 would be in play. But for 30 years, James never wavered after his conversion and became the leader of the Jerusalem church. And then there's Saul, who later became Paul on the road to Damascus. He appeared to Paul. Now, Paul was a Pharisee. He was such a strong believer in the Jewish traditions that when these Christians who were upsetting the apple cart in terms of the authority of the Sanhedrin, which was the ruling council of the priests in Jerusalem, when he saw the Christians undermining their authority, he went to the mat trying to persecute Christians to get them to shut up and pipe down. And so he was actually one of the ones who was watching or holding the cloaks of those who were stoning Stephen, who was probably the first martyr in the book of Acts. And so he is going around arresting and persecuting, and in some cases killing Christian believers, until he's on the way from Jerusalem to Damascus and has this appearance of Jesus, who asks him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And so this apparition, this appearance of Jesus, convinces him that Jesus has indeed risen from the dead. And of course, for the rest of his life, Paul becomes the intellectual leader of the Christian church, and wrote most of the books in the New Testament. So we have people that were skeptics or hostile to the faith, actively opposing it, who became believers based on the resurrection and these resurrection appearances. There was also a narrative that Paul mentions that he appeared to as many as 500 people at one time. That's a pretty strong testimony, and it's a pretty strong way in which Paul goes out on a limb here, because if I were to say to you, I spoke to the Reasonable Faith group at UT Dallas, but I was not here last week, and I said I spoke to the Reasonable Faith last week, it'd be pretty bold to come here and tell you guys I was your speaker last week, because who could oppose me? All of you witnesses, right? Was anybody here last week? Did you have a meeting last week? I'm making this up. You did have a meeting, okay. So if I claimed that and then came to the very people that were here and knew I wasn't here, that'd be bad. So Paul, making this claim, while many of these people, if not most of them, were still alive, he would have been overruled if that was not the case. Somebody would have said, one of these 500 would have said, that never happened. He didn't appear to us. Somebody would have fessed up. But there are no counter narratives suggesting that maybe it really happened. Then we get historians. Now, some of these historians are not hostile, some are, but the historical approach, and this is from Sean McDowell in Evidence That Demands a Verdict, he says, a historical approach examines witnesses living at the time of the event or living soon after it to hear firsthand accounts. So that's where we get into either those who were direct witnesses or those who heard from the direct witnesses, so no more than one generation of witness old. That's kind of what we're looking for. So the gospel writers, what we see with the Gospels is we have differing details that reinforce the main narrative, but they don't conflict in the main narrative. They may add different perspectives. The number of angels is one that is frequently cited by critics as well. Were there one or two? It must be a lie. Well, no, it might be a difference in perspective. But again, it's the same story with different points of emphasis. In fact, the four Gospels tell the story of Christ from different perspectives. So in Mark, for example, Jesus is portrayed as the servant. In Matthew, he's portrayed as the king of the Jews. So each of the Gospel writers is emphasizing a different point, and they do it by selecting stories that help them to communicate that portrayal of Jesus to the listeners. So then we have the church fathers. This again would be the one generation old witnesses of the people who were the witnesses. So one of the first ones is Clement of Rome. He was personally acquainted with several of the apostles. He was executed in 100 AD. Again, convinced that that the resurrection had happened. Tertullian, who was a first-century theologian, called him Peter's successor as a leader of the church. So highly regarded. And so he tells his tale. Ignatius was a disciple of John, also testifies to the resurrection. And Polycarp, who's a disciple of John, also talks about our Lord Jesus Christ, who for our sins suffered even unto death, but whom God raised from the dead, having loosed the bands of the grave. So you have these first century guys, and there are many others I could have cited as well, who give testimony to what the apostles were saying, and the apostles being the eyewitnesses. So we have some other guys that we'll look at. So we have some secular historians who are not as friendly as the previous group would have been. So Tacitus is a Roman historian, lived in the late 1st into the 2nd century. He wrote that Christ was executed under Pontius Pilate. He hated Christians and considered Nero's torture of them to have been warranted. He also claimed that a deadly superstition broke out afterwards, and he doesn't specify what that is, but it certainly aligns well with what he would have considered a superstition, that this Jesus guy had risen from the dead. So we don't know what the exact nature of the superstition is, but it certainly fits well with the narrative. Again, a guy who does not like Christians, but is telling the basic facts of the story, even though he disagrees with the conclusions of Christians. We also have Josephus, we mentioned earlier. He was a Jewish historian who worked for the Romans. And here's one of the key passages. This Ananus thought he had now a proper opportunity to exercise his authority. He assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. He delivered them to be stoned. So this is telling the narrative of James being executed, saying that he was the brother of Jesus, again confirming the story we had about James and the fact that he was executed, and the fact that the Sanhedrin was exercising authority to do these kinds of things. It shows that James was Jesus' brother, and that Jesus was executed under a particular emperor, and that he was executed for being a Christian. So again, we get some of the key narratives, details confirmed. So timing-wise, we said earlier that it's important to have early testimonies. And so when you look at some of these dates, Mark was probably the first of the Gospels that was written. There's some disagreement about whether Paul started writing his letters to 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. I was talking to one of you earlier who suggested Thessalonians was probably the first book written, and I think that may be the case, but it's right in that same time period, within a few years. Everybody pretty much agrees that Mark was written around 50 AD, no later than 55, and was probably the first of the Gospels that was written. Now, Mark was a disciple of Peter, so Mark is essentially telling Peter's story, Peter being the impulsive guy who probably at that point was too busy to write things down. He would later write 1st and 2nd Peter, but Mark starts the ball rolling with writing this gospel to make sure that it gets in writing. You know, when the apostles were first sent out after the crucifixion, resurrection, all that stuff, they thought that Jesus was going to come back fairly soon. And in Jesus' timetable, he is. But God's timetable is not our timetable, and so he'll come back when it's the right time. But they initially, I think they were really focused on spreading the message, but not on writing it down. And then when 20 years goes by, they go, you know, we probably ought to write some of this down before some more of us, already we've got some martyrs. So we need to have these narratives written down so that there will be a record of it. And so Mark is the first one who does that. And again, well within the eyewitness lifespan, within 20 years of the events themselves. And then we have all of Paul's written letters. In fact, the entire New Testament almost is written before this key date of 70 AD. We have a few books that are probably written after that point. The book of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Revelation, we believe to be late 1st century. But we think that the rest were all done before 70 AD because there was a really key event that happened in 70 AD. Anybody know what that was? Yeah, Jerusalem was destroyed. Now, Jesus said that Jerusalem would be destroyed. And you would think that these guys trying to build a case to help people understand that Jesus was in fact a prophet, that if one of his prophecies came true, they would have recorded it. The fact that none of these books record the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD is one of the many indicators that says that they were all written before that point. And the books of John later in the 1st century, his focus is not on fulfilled prophecy and Revelation, it's on future prophecy. And he's writing an encouraging letter to brothers in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. So he's got other things in mind besides that, but he doesn't mention it either. So again, we have these early writings, almost certainly within 40 years of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, or at least the fact that people believed that they had seen those things. So we have an early series of narratives. We also have the creeds. The creeds are really important because they tell very, very early. In fact, before the book of Mark, people believe these creeds were being circulated. This was largely, but not exclusively, an oral culture. But people memorized things and would repeat them. And so you can kind of hear this very memorizable passage that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians, which again, one of the earlier letters. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And then he adds this, which probably was not part of the creed. Then he appeared to James and to all the apostles. That part may be. And last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born, like outside the events. And so we've got this almost sing-songy repetition of this happened, this happened, this happened. And we believe that these, and there are a number of them throughout the letters of Paul especially, where we have this easy to memorize series of key events. And you've got it all right there. That he died for our sins in accordance with Scriptures. He was buried, raised on the 3rd day, appeared to all these different people. And so these creeds predate the writing of this book because Paul's including it as something that they would have been familiar with and needed to be reminded of so that they would be, in fact, memorizing it. And there's Gary Habermas has done a lot of work on the importance of these creeds, and others have as well. So let's look at next some of the alternative explanations, because there are some other stories out there about what happened to Jesus. One is, and we're not going to go into a lot, this is where we're going to use the telescope view. We're not going to use the microscope view, but I'm going to have you help me analyze these, okay? So one is that Jesus only apparently died, he fainted and then recovered. Now, based on what we've looked at before, what do you think of this possible alternative explanation? Okay, so that would strike this one, make it less likely. What else? The stabbing, yeah, the spear. The fact that the blood and water had separated, sure. What else?
Roman soldiers being motivated not to
Right.
carry out their job, right?
Right.
Being punished for it.
Right, being motivated not to mess
to
up.
fail.
Right, their job was to deliver a dead prisoner. One dead prisoner, check mark, right? So probably not a lot of credibility on this one. Anybody have any other thoughts on this, on why it might be a good explanation?
When he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, they probably would not have followed a zombie who had
Right.
died and
Right. So the fact that we know that he was buried, he would have had to push the rock away, right? And somehow sneak past the Roman soldiers, which, by the way, the Roman soldiers were assigned to guard that tomb after he was in there. So he wouldn't have known there would be Roman soldiers out there. He wouldn't have known he was supposed to be quiet. He wouldn't have known he has to sneak around. It's interesting, too, that, well, we'll get to the shape of the round. Let me just make the idea that the stone was rolled away suggests that it was round. And that's the depiction we've seen throughout history in our pictures and so on. But most of the gravestones were actually square or rectangular. And so it's an unusual grave that has a round stone. It's not the most common. It's a little more expensive for someone like Joseph of Arimathea would have been feasible. But again, the stone, given the size of it to cover an opening, would have been hundreds and hundreds of pounds. Some have suggested it certainly weighed at least 400 to 500 pounds. So now you have this emaciated man who hasn't eaten in days, hasn't slept in days, except that he fainted and now he's recovered supposedly. But lots of blood loss, hasn't had any fluid in days, didn't breathe for a long time. But now he's supposed to recover and somehow get himself out of the tomb and past the guards. So probably not a real highly feasible alternative. So that's the first one. How about this next one? There were body snatchers. Someone stole the body. What do you think of that one? Guards would have stopped them. Okay.
Possible, but then that explains nothing of how the Christian tradition arose.
Good point. Yeah.
There probably wouldn't be cloth left over. Like they probably would have taken those as well.
I'm sorry, would have taken what?
The burial cloth.
Oh yeah, if they were grave robbers, they wouldn't care. They would leave the body and take the stuff, right? Yeah. So that again doesn't hold a lot of water. Some back here.
I was going to bring up that if the body had been stolen, then the Romans or Jewish authorities would have claimed that it had been stolen. But I think they did claim that it had been stolen. Anyway.
They did.
They did, yeah.
They did claim that, yeah. So they were the originators of the body snatching story. Yeah. Any other thoughts on that? Interestingly enough, God's timing is impeccable. Just a few years before Jesus was crucified, there was a series of grave robberies where relics were stolen. And so they actually, the Romans enacted a law that anyone found guilty of grave robbing would be executed. So a fairly stiff punishment, might be a bit of a deterrent, you know. But again, who would have stolen the body? Who was motivated to steal the body? The disciples, the same guys that wouldn't even stand around in sight of the crucifixion, right? These are not exactly your, stereotypical heroic, come out and slay the dragon kind of guys. So again, this one's a little difficult to find much credibility. How about this one? Hallucination, simultaneous imagination. We all saw it at once. Say again? Yeah. Okay, we'll go there, there, and there. Yes.
You kind of brought up that same point of like when there's something that's happened and it's so significant and you remember it from so long ago, it's like how can you just hallucinate over that?
Yeah. Yeah.
How many people are.
Great point. Yep.
I was going to bring up for the simultaneous hallucination thing the miracle of the sun in Portugal. Basically, in 1917, a bunch of people claimed that the Virgin Mary had appeared and caused the sun to zip around, changing colors and otherwise showing a bunch of different phenomena. It's fairly self-explanatory that the astronomers did not see this, at least those that weren't at the location.
I haven't studied that one. That's great. It might be a great counterpoint, but I don't know about that one. Okay. Okay, and they were seeing the same thing though, right? Or similar, having similar experiences. Yeah.
Over a period of time, that would have been more than enough time for people to kind of get together and say, have you been seeing this?
Right. Right. Yep.
Have been motivated to, so motivated they saw hallucinations that they just wanted to be true, but then at that point, there's no reason that the Jewish authorities and Romans wouldn't have brought out the body of Jesus that has not been stolen.
Exactly. Right. That's all they had to do to defeat any of these, right, is find the body. They've also done a fair amount of study on hallucination, and they've found that it's exceedingly rare for someone to have a visual hallucination as well as an auditory one. So you might hear a voice or you might see a vision, but you almost never see a talking vision. Interesting hallucination point. And as several of you pointed out, it's almost impossible to conceive that multiple people would have the same hallucination of seeing, hearing, touching, multiple senses, seeing this guy and experiencing his presence, all seeing the same thing and being able to corroborate that you saw that too, right? He just came through the wall. Well, yeah, I did. I wouldn't admit it make me look like an idiot, but yeah, I saw it. Okay, so anyway. So
you can't usually share a fish dinner with a hallucination either.
Exactly.
Touch
Hallucinations
thirst,
don't
the wounded
usually
side.
eat. Yeah, don't make the fish disappear. Okay, let's go to the next one. Wrong tomb. Mary and the witnesses lost in space. What do you think? Why? Yeah, great point. Yes. I'm sorry?
The body was missing.
Okay.
So that, also,
Well, if his tomb was empty and they found it empty, yes, that's correct. Yeah. Yeah. Wait, she was first. Sorry, I'm sorry. Right. Right. Yeah. So the guards marking the spot should have been a pretty good cue. So the Jewish authorities went to and this is one of the criticisms of this theory of the guards, is that the Jewish, so he's placed in the tomb. The next morning, it's still Sabbath, and so they're not supposed to be doing work, but the Jewish authorities have the wherewithal to go to Pilate and say, hey, we need some guards before Sabbath is over. So this is the next morning. So the tomb is unguarded overnight. So one of the theories is, well, maybe they did it before the guards were posted. Again, these are the same guys who ran away from the scene. So again, not a lot of credibility. Yes?
If I remember correctly, this tomb belonged to Joseph of Arimathea.
Correct.
Who was like a known friend of
Correct.
the Christians. So presumably, if Joseph had heard, hey, the tomb's empty, Jesus is alive, he would have been able to go to the tomb and see, no, he's still there.
Yeah, he would have gone to the correct tomb and said, no, this one's mine over here. The one with the guards and the seal, right? Yeah. So again, probably not going to happen. And I hadn't thought about this till you mentioned. I'm sorry, what's your name? David. Until you mentioned it, I didn't think about this. But my dad passed away in 2000. Let me think about the year. 2005, and probably 15 years later, around 2020, I had not been to that cemetery. It's up. I grew up in Nebraska. You've guys heard of Nebraska? Small state, middle of the country. Used to have a football team. Anyway, I went back. I was there and hadn't been to the cemetery in quite some time. Went to where I thought it was. Walked right up to it. And this is just a flat gravestone, grave marker. He and my mom my mom and dad both buried there. Found it right away. So those things do leave a strong impression on where they are. And this was not a tomb with a big stone and all that stuff, So yes, I think that's a really good point, is that you do remember those kind of things when they're a friend or a personal acquaintance. Okay, and then family tomb. This one was just a couple years ago. They made a big scene. James Cameron made a movie about it. There was this series of ossuaries. Now, what happened with Jewish burial tradition is that they would bury the person in a tomb, and then the flesh would deteriorate over a period of time. They would take the bones, put them in a box called an ossuary. So they found this tomb with a bunch of ossuaries, and some of the names may have had some fragments of letters that indicated similar names to Jesus and some of his family members. anyway, I'm not even going to go into it. It's so outrageous. Nobody takes it seriously because for a lot of reasons, but I'll just throw it up there. It was a sensational thing for about 5 minutes, and then people started looking at it and said, nobody's going to take this seriously. So a lot of times you'll hear these great big stories and maybe even a movie, but you don't hear the retraction because it's not as noteworthy. So we'll just leave that one alone. And then myth or legend, the idea that resurrection stories came much later. So they'll say, Jesus was just a myth. We didn't hear about all this stuff about resurrection until so much later that it can't be possibly true. But in fact, what's wrong with this one?
Creed was as early as anything.
Right, and the
got it
book of Mark within 20 years, et cetera. So, all right, so what we're going to do next is we're going to do some data analysis. You guys are computer scientists, so if we take these theories and we add one, and that is resurrection. That's the possible alternative theory, right? Jesus actually rose from the dead. So let's throw that in the mix. And then we're going to kind of analyze this and put it into a table. So we'll put these, we'll simplify these descriptors, and we'll put it into kind of a table form. And then these are the 5 Gary Habermas ideas, the 5 minimal facts, and we'll do the same thing with those things. So we'll put those into a simplified verbiage, and we'll put that into a table, and we'll say, okay, given these 5 facts that are agreed on by everybody and those alternatives, let's see what makes sense. So if we look at these one at a time, we'll do it quickly here. So what about the apparent death one? Well, it would explain the empty tomb, and it would explain the appearances, right? Because if in fact he didn't die, he might have appeared. Might not have been very convincing, but it doesn't explain a number of things. It doesn't explain the fact that he died if he is apparently dead. It doesn't affect. It's not going to get enemies to convert if you've got this barely alive guy supposedly raised from the dead, and it's not an early narrative. It came much, much later. So in order, the rules are this. You have to have all green check marks in order for this to be a credible narrative, right? So what do we think on this one? We're going to say no. Wish the volume was a little hot. We should have turned the volume up louder earlier. All right, what about the body stolen? We can do a similar kind of a thing. Oh, I didn't know that one was going to change to an X, but at any rate. So the body stolen would explain that Jesus died because there'd be a body, a dead body that was stolen. But if the body is stolen, well, okay, so that should have a check mark on the tomb empty, but it doesn't explain anything else. Okay, similarly, hallucination, we looked at this one, and if we look at the hallucinations, we could have a couple things that might explain he died, but they hallucinated later. Enemies converting based on the stories, maybe. Early narrative, probably not. Again, we have some X's, and we don't have a consistent bunch of check marks. Wrong tomb, similar idea. You can kind of see where this is going. You get some yeses and some nos. The family tomb thing, yeah, that would explain that he died because you have bones, but it doesn't explain anything else. So you're, again, there. If it's a myth or a legend, it, again, takes a long time to develop. It might explain that he died, but then there's this myth that develops. You might have some enemies convert, unlikely, but you have a lot of things it doesn't explain. So again, you have no dice. But when you get to the resurrection, it does explain that Jesus died, that the tomb was empty, that he appeared to people, that enemies converted, and you have an early narrative, and so what you end up with is a winner. And so that's a way to kind of cross-check the narratives and the possibilities with the minimal facts argument. So then the question is, how important is it that Jesus died and was raised from the dead? Well, we'll look at a couple different faiths and look at their traditions. In Islam, history is not as important as revelation. And so they don't really give a lot of credence to anything about Jesus. In fact, they completely changed the story about Jesus. But again, their truth or falsehood in Islam is mainly based on the character of Muhammad and how he lived his life, questionable by our standards at sometimes, but at any rate, it was based on his stories. So he would say he was transported. That becomes a major belief factor for Islam. But there's no corroboration. There's no archaeological evidence. Whereas Christian is a faith that's based on evidence, Islam is based on revelation. You could do a similar thing with other Eastern traditions. By the way, Christianity is, well, we'll get to Christian. So this is Hinduism. They view history as cyclic and a process of continual change. Again, not a lot of emphasis on history. It's mainly an emphasis on internal revelation and wellness. And a similar sort of a thing with Buddhism. Again, around we're at 7% of the world. And they're mainly concerned with these, this escaping the endless cycle of death and resurrection and reincarnation. So again, they don't really put that much emphasis on history. But to Christianity, 31% of the world, ostensibly, and that would include Coptic Christians, Catholics, Protestants, nominal Christians, those who say they're Christians but support non-Christian things. At any rate, for us, history is everything. We have an evidence-based faith. If the resurrection did not happen, we have no faith. So the question is sometimes posed, if they found Jesus' body and they could prove it was Jesus' body, would you still be a Christian? No, because the story's not true. For us, it's all about the truth, the coherence to actual facts. And so the fact is what really matters to us. In John 20, 30, and 31, he says, Jesus did many other miracles in the presence of his disciples that are not recorded in the book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have faith in his name. It's the believing, it's placing trust in something that activates that faith. It's kind of like, I was an airline pilot for many years. So if you believed that my airplane and me as a pilot would get you from New York to California, but you didn't get on the airplane, you didn't really put trust in it. You might have intellectually believed it, but it is not sufficient to get you there. So similarly, if you believe intellectually that Jesus, he probably lived, died, maybe even rose from the dead, but you're not trusting in what he did to pay for the sins, the debt that I owe, if you're not trusting in his payment to cover your own sins, then you're not you're not a believer. You're not one who would be guaranteed of a relationship with God forever. This idea of believing is very consistent throughout the scriptures. In the book of 1 John, I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know. I write to you who believe, that you may know that you have eternal life. And one of the most famous verses of all time, of course, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him, not whoever does more good works than bad works, not whose good works outweigh the bad works, but who places trust in him, shall not perish but have eternal life. So it really does matter. And with that, I will encourage you to think about that as you're going home tonight. But for now, questions? Anything we haven't covered? Yes, sir.
So I was a student in the 1980s, and I remember on television a lot of faith healers
Yes.
would have like a person who was lame come up, and they would pretend to heal them, and then people would later find out, well, it was just a charlatan situation.
Right.
So I don't know how many students live in the dormitory, but I can imagine going back to my dormitory after a talk like this, and the question being posed, what about today? Christianity would be more believable if I could see someone rise from the dead today.
Yep.
Right? Some Christians hold to a doctrine called cessationism. I don't know
Mhm.
if you've heard that term.
Yep.
Yeah, so the idea that these miracles don't happen today. And some say, well, they happen all the time, you just don't believe. So how do you respond to that kind of skepticism about miracles in the present moment?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. For me, I think God uses miracles to validate his claims about Jesus, especially when the church is spreading. And so we hear from those who are missionaries overseas, especially, we hear stories all the time about miracles that we don't typically see here. And somebody asked a faith healer who was a legitimate faith healer in a foreign culture, how come we don't see those kind of miracles here? And he says, you have 911. God can work through all kinds of ways. And he recognized that God worked through doctors, through nurses, through ambulances, through medics, to save people that would not otherwise be saved. But it seems like when Christianity is advancing into a skeptical culture, for the first time especially, that's when you see a preponderance of miracles. Even in the Old Testament, we don't see miracles happening all the time. We see brief periods in which miracles happen. So we obviously, the creation of the world, from our perspective as Christians, is a miraculous event. We see miracles around the time of Moses, around the time of a few of the judges, and then really nothing happens miraculous-wise until we get to the prophets. But we don't know that they're prophetically miraculous until we see the prophecies fulfilled later. And then the period of Jesus, where we have a burst of miracles. So the norm, the stasis, is no miracles. Why? Because then when a miracle happens, it's a miracle, and it gets your attention. So that'd be my response, is that miracles are unusual, and for that reason, when God uses them, they really stand out. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I'd respond. Yep.
I also would question if in the modern era of CGI, Photoshop,
Yeah.
AI-generated imagery, if miracles even would be believed in the developed world, assuming what happened.
Yeah, I think.
See it personally. There's no way you could trust the video.
Yeah,
Even
right.
if you saw it, and even if you saw it personally, you might assume, oh, there's some trickery. Maybe they had two different guys.
Or, yeah, that's
Yeah,
true. It's
Yeah.
high-tech world that you couldn't hardly establish.
Probably wouldn't even.
Unless it was really a dramatic miracle or something.
Well, then you get creative storytelling where the hero dies at the end of the season, and they come back the next season, they go, oh, he wasn't really dead. So they can do all kinds of things.
Alternate universe.
And so sometimes I wonder if we cheapen miracles by showing them so readily. Every time Tom Cruise does some kind of a stunt, I think it's a miracle, but he actually does many of them with safety harnesses. But we tend to sensationalize things to the extent that we don't recognize miracles as being what they are sometimes. So that's a good point. Yeah.
You said that to be a true Christian, it's not works, it's you believing him and believing in his resurrection.
And what I like to say is placing trust in it. It's not just understanding. Yeah.
So, as a Muslim,
Mm-hmm.
I believe that works and belief come together.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's explicitly stated in the Quran that it's good deeds and belief in Allah and
Mhm.
His signs after. So, taking your explanation, can't I say that, okay, there is this person that's done evil deeds, maybe all of his life, and he believed in Jesus and he trusted in him, he fulfilled your description. Does he just walk into the kingdom?
It's a great question. Yeah, so of the two other men who were crucified at the same time as Jesus, one of them continued mocking him during the entire crucifixion, according to the stories. The other repented and said, remember me when you come in your kingdom. And Jesus said to that person, today you will be with me in paradise. Indicating that there is no point for a person where it's too late to put trust in Christ. In other words, if our good deeds are indeed not enough to gain us a relationship with God, then it doesn't matter how many good deeds you have time to do after you have become a Christian. It's not based on that. So for us, good deeds are not the reason that we have a relationship with God. They're a result of having a relationship with God. So we do good deeds as well, but we do them out of gratitude and out of obedience and honor and love for Christ, instead of doing them in order to gain honor and love and obedience and relationship.
Yeah, but to respond to that, it's near the end of this criminal's life.
Very end, yes. Yeah.
The dude died less than
Yeah.
an hour later.
Yeah, right, right.
So, in Islam, if this person would be heavily judged on the Day of Judgment,
Mm-hmm.
and God would not enter him into paradise until he makes it right and makes the affairs that this person, this criminal, was involved
Mhm.
So it's in our religion, God takes the affairs of the people, He makes it separate. So you have to gain the forgiveness of the people you've wronged in order to be for there to be justice.
Mhm.
So I just don't see that same type of justice like being portrayed here.
Sure.
I'm just seeing that what constitutes true believer.
Well, first of all, let me tell you, I really respect you for being in a relatively Christian-centered organization and air your views. I appreciate that. I know it takes some bravery and courage to do that. So thank you for being here and for stating those views. It's helpful to hear. Again, it's a paradigm shift. Jesus, we find in the first chapter of the book of John that he was actually the creator. He was the part of, and I know we disagree on the Trinity, but he was the person of God, the entity within God's oneness that actually did the creating. And so think about it. I build things out of wood. I build bookcases and I built my computer desk and so on. I can take that desk and I can chop it into pieces. I can burn it up, and it's not a crime. I made it. I get to do that. If you did it, that would be a problem, okay? But I get to do that. God, as the one who made everything, can do what he sees fit. In the case of me needing payment, here's an illustration. Suppose that I do a good deed every day of my life, okay? And I live to be 100 years old. And in my years of living to 100 years old, assuming I did a good deed every day from the time I popped out of the womb till I died, that's going to be 36,500 good deeds. How does 36,500, suppose that I got a year off for every day that I did a good deed, okay? That would be 36,500 years time off for good behavior. Now, does anybody in their foggiest imagination think that you've worked hard enough or been good enough to earn 36,000 years of vacation time? And yet we're talking about an eternal relationship with God. We cannot earn it. So instead what God did was he said, I myself will take the punishment that you owe. And the punishment that Jesus took was not just his pain on the cross. It was separation from the Father. He never deserved separation, but he took separation during the period he was on the cross.
I understand that.
Okay.
We also have a similar opinion
Okay.
on that in Islam. In Islam, we're told that deeds will not enter us into the dark, into paradise. It is God's mercy from looking at you and looking at your behavior
Mm-hmm.
that will enter you into paradise. My concern is just in the justice aspect
Right,
of,
right.
of this example of the criminal.
And so the justice aspect is this: the penalty for not living a life of purity is separation from God. So as we understand it, death is separation. So when I die physically, my spirit separates from my body. If I die spiritually, my spirit separates from God's spirit. The penalty for sin is separation from God. I've chosen to reject his guidance, and he's chosen to allow me to live in that eternally. That's separation. Jesus experienced that separation, but he didn't earn it. He didn't deserve that separation because he never sinned. And so God said, I will take this separation that is payment for sin, and I will apply it to those who put trust in the one who put that payment together. So that's the justice aspect, is that the payment was made, that Christ made it himself. And go ahead.
This is between the people. This you wouldn't in a regular court, you wouldn't have other people who aren't in this matter be on the stance, right? Because usually you have the people that are only
Mhm.
it's very limited, right?
Right.
It's
So
one
let me
person
just
on
let me just respond. I think I know. So in our perspective, the person we sinned against ultimately is God. So if I steal from Alan, I'm actually breaking God's character, because God is a God who respects property. I am wronging him, but he has his own sins to pay for. My ultimate payment is owed to God.
And I might never forget Rick if I'm
Yeah,
some
right.
jerk or something. No matter what he does, he can pay me $1 million, and
So
he might never get.
it's a good thing that it's God that I have to be right with and not.
There's an explanation for what you just said too. I won't get into the details though.
Well, let me do this. I will
Okay.
stay as long as you want afterwards, but let me see if there are other questions because I know it's about time
Probably
when
need
we.
to maybe one. There was a hand
Wrap it up.
Maybe
Yeah.
one more quick
I was
comment.
actually just about to bring up the time, that we might want to cut it off here.
Yeah.
So-
Okay.
But if you have time, we usually go to a restaurant after reasonable date, and I would be very interested in this conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to hear some more. Yeah.
Yeah, good chance to learn about Islam more.
Any other one last question before we quit?
I guess not. I saw his
Okay.
hand go up. That's
Yeah.
what I was referring to,
Okay,
so.
Kenneth, it's all yours.
I forgot it. Maybe I was raising my hand to applaud you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for letting me get. This is my one chance a year to wear my reasonable faith shirt. So thank you for letting me drag it out of the closet. Okay, thanks, guys.
That was good. Well organized. I like that.
So I think that we're going to go to a sandwich shop on Preston.
Yeah, it's called Chiba Hut Toasted Subs with Quotes. I don't like what the quotes imply, but I have it on good authority. So the sandwiches are good.
Can you spell that?
Yeah, so that's
CHEBA.
CHEBA.
Okay. Chiba. I will put a link in the Discord. Okay. Because
no, I was
links
links
are
to
good.
Discord. There you go.
How could you?
Okay.
Toasted is in quotes. What the heck?
Yeah, I know. Okay. I'll say that at least as the schedule stands right now, next week is our night for student presentations, which will mean crunch time for those of us who are actually preparing those presentations. Was I supposed to tell you? What? I think I was like halfway through the Do you want to halfway?
You're
do
in.
the other halfway? Okay, great.
Good.
Yeah, so that's going to be an interesting night. We're going to have some various topics about apologetics, such as what is your topic in 5 seconds?
In 5 seconds,
Okay, then anyway, so we're going to have
Reuben the man versus Reuben the sin.
That's a quick 5 seconds.
No, I'm sure it's going to be really good. But in addition, what do you want to say?
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. It's another take on the